Hello again. In this section, we will focus on the second most important factor of change, which is privacy and regulation. Now, privacy has clearly become a much bigger topic of conversation in the last few years, and it's been a bigger concern both for consumers and marketers. According to data that you can see on this slide, and it comes from a study that MMA Global did in 2021, more than 80% of consumers, especially older, that you can see them on the right-hand side of this slide, have some concern about how companies are using their online data. You can see with the red color that two-thirds of those or more are very concerned or extremely concerned with how companies are using their data. So with that in mind, it's not a surprise that uh, there have been specific significant changes in regulation to account for this concern. And these changes aim to protect consumer rights and how companies and change how companies use user data. Now, let me talk about some of these changes. GDPR is probably the one that most people have heard, and CCPA is the other one, which stands for California Consumer Privacy Act. The first one was introduced in 2018, the second one in 2020. Both of those things combined created probably a frenzy of activity for companies who had to take a number of steps to ensure that they're compliant. For instance, they had to map the consumer data. They have to really understand what data is collected and how, where the data is stored, who the data is shared with. So the whole kind of journey of data collection and sharing, right? It also meant that companies had to fine tune some of the privacy disclosures on their websites, to introduce new processes to allow customers to opt out. So there was a lot of things that they had to do. And in addition to that, they also had to make big investments in software and in training in order to better manage data, to protect themselves from data breaches, which unfortunately have become very common, and so on and so forth. So again, a frenzy of activity in response to this specific regulation. Now, while all this was happening, some of the big platforms also started to introduce their own anti-tracking changes in response to the regulation. So I'm going to talk about some of that now. Probably the most notable changes happened when Firefox and Safari blocked third-party cookies. That had an immediate impact in terms of drastically decreasing the size of the addressable web inventory, ad inventory. You can see with the pie chart on the right that, right now, as of 2021, actually, the addressable kind of web inventory was about 56%, because the remaining was Firefox and Safari. And as most of you probably know or have heard, there is the announcement from Google to remove third-party cookies from Chrome in 2023, which of course accounts for most of what's left, and that's why it's been called the cookie apocalypse. Right. So a lot is happening on the website of things, and all of those changes are kind of have probably making tracking much more difficult. At the same time, Apple also introduced its own anti-tracking changes with its IDFA framework in 2021. Now, what IDFA does is that it basically reverses the tracking process from an opt-out to an opt-in. What that means basically is that consumers need to specifically give permission to each app that they use in order to let that app track them. So it kind of raises the bar, and it makes it much more difficult for consumers to kind of share their data. Now, in short, to summarize, a ton of changes happening here. So the question is really, well, actually twofold. Are markets prepared for these changes? And how is all that going to impact advertising and the whole advertising process, from planning, executing, and measuring campaign effectiveness? Now, the quick answer to the first one, according to a study conducted by BCG and MMA in 2021, is that unfortunately only 12% of companies feel that they're fully prepared at the time. The vast majority of companies, 88%, feels that a lot more needs to be done. For instance, investment in new types of data partnerships, investment in more durable technology infrastructure, investment in data governance, better C-level alignment on the direction and investments that need to take. And last but not least, a clear need to evolve the approach that these companies are taking in terms of media measurement and attribution. So again, 88% of companies feel that they're not fully prepared and there's a lot more work that needs to be done. So companies don't feel prepared. Now, let's talk about the expected impact of these changes on the marketing process. Before we jump in, I have to say that there's a number of predictions and it's really hard kind of to gauge exactly what's going to happen, partly because some of the facts are continuing to change, right? For instance, the IAB did a study with Harvard in 2020 and estimated that up to $40 billion would be lost from open web because of cookie deprecation. And the assumption there that they made was that a lot of the advertising would actually shift to walled gardens. Now, arguably that was 2020 and some of that prediction may have changed after Apple introduced their own anti-tracking framework in 2021, which was particularly and is particularly negative for walled gardens. And again, that's kind of an example of how some of these changes are conflicting, and it's really hard to kind of gauge where how things are going to net out. Another example of that is that the IAB did some really detailed analysis of how these changes will impact the marketing process. The assessment that they made is that these changes will have a strong negative impact across the board. And you can see with the red light, anything from how we do consumer research, how we kind of execute and optimize media, and then how we kind of do the post-campaign analysis. All of it is red, meaning that they predict it's going to be a significant negative and high impact when it comes to the cookie deprecation on these specific use cases. Now, again, to be clear, also in this case, the industry doesn't seem to fully agree, and some actually see this as a positive change overall. So although we have this very thoughtful analysis here, there is the argument that there are many studies that talk about the current state of cookies. And the main point that they're making is that a lot of the associated audience data that comes from these cookies is of really bad quality. For instance, one of these studies estimates that gender data in many cases are only 42% accurate in predicting actual gender. Now, let me kind of say that again. Gender data from cookies are only 42% accurate in predicting gender, which of course means that they're less accurate than flipping a coin, right? So in other words, the argument here is that, in some cases, cookie deprecation may actually be a good thing because there's a lot that is broken in the current infrastructure, and that will give us kind of the ability to kind of start afresh and kind of build better foundations. But either way, I think the moral of the story here and one of the key takeaways is that there's a lot of confusion in the market in terms of what the impact will be. But at least there's two areas that I'd like us to focus a bit more before we wrap up this section. The first one is how marketers are thinking about replacing cookies in the short term. Okay, and the data that you see on this chart are from an MMA marketer study in 2021. And what you can see here with the first bar is that at least 1 out of 2 marketers plans to continue relying on cookies as the main identity solution for at least another 2 years. And you can see like 50 to 70% or 70% and more. So they think that cookies are going to be their main kind of identity solution for the next couple of years. At the same time, of course, there's a lot of experimentation, and they're experimenting with other solutions because obviously by 2023, cookies are going to go away. And those solutions are primarily hashed emails and cohort-based solutions. I think this is too detailed probably for this course, but there's a lot of discussion in the industry about these types of solutions. And both of these solutions will kind of help them with both targeting and attribution efforts. Now, I'd like to make a special kind of note on the 5th bar on this screen, which is contextual solution, because a lot of discussions taking place about the increasing utility of these solutions. Now, there's some expectations that advertising spend will move there because it's one of these areas that is less impacted by the changes. They don't rely so much on cookies. And that would become more interesting with the addition of AI personalization capabilities. So again, we have to be thinking both in terms of like how we execute media, where the media spend will go in the absence of cookies. Contextual kind of solutions would be one of these areas, but also how we're going to be measuring campaign effectiveness, which is the topic of this slide. And it's really about the changes that are happening in the measurement and attribution space. Now, as we discussed in other parts of this course, companies currently use a number of tools to measure campaign performance. To mention some of them, we have what we call MMM, which is marketing mix modeling that uses aggregate data. We have MTA, which is multi-touch attribution that uses data at the level of the individual. And then you have another variety of tools, specifically tests to measure incrementality, and so on and so forth. Now, what seems to be the main theme that emerges from all the discussion is that there is no one-size-fits-all measurement tool or approach. MTA is important for part of the spend, and that can be tracked by it because it provides the more granular insights. But it's going to be kind of increasingly kind of become more difficult, with cookie deprecation as well. MMM also has its role for the bigger picture, but it has its own limitations. And then, of course, you still need to have experiments and lift studies for other parts of the spend, like, for instance, walled gardens. So the problem that marketers are increasingly facing with right now is that these tools don't talk to each other. So as privacy regulations are being introduced, anti-tracking changes are becoming more common, marketers will need to do more stitching across different tools, across all the different tools, right? So in the end, the key focus for most marketers, as you can see from the bar to the left, is that they will need to manage and better integrate tools. They will need to do more heavy lifting in terms of reconciling results. And at the end of the day, they will need to find ways to unify kind of all this data in order to see which part of the campaign works and which didn't. So to summarize, a lot of changes happening in the privacy landscape. We have new regulation, we have anti-tracking changes that are being introduced. The main challenge for marketers is that these changes not only cause uncertainty, but they also create a need for a whole new skill set. One is that more technical in areas of regulation, in areas of ad tech, but also in areas of ad science, data science. In the end, the truth is that although this still brings the promise of more addressability and measurability, all these changes are creating new challenges. In some cases, they're forcing us to rethink the way that we run and measure media. As this is happening, marketers will continue to shift their media allocation in search of higher reach, better performance, and increased cost effectiveness. We will also try to find new ways to unify measurement, which will become the new holy grail. Now, in the end, these changes will push companies to take control of their data. They have to. As we said earlier, in this section, GDPR and CCPA have already pushed marketers to start mapping their data. And this is kind of an example of a map like that. So this will be a continuous journey for marketers, not only to ensure that they are compliant for regulation, but also to improve data governance, make the right investments, and better activate the data that they collect.